most companies don't struggle with incentive design because they lack strategy. So let's think about it a little bit more philosophically for our listeners rather than saying like 3's the magic number.
I've seen this in practice recently. We've talked before about utilities, for example. They tend to have a lot of different measures.
A board should never approve a scorecard. It cannot explain itself.
At some point, the question is, are there too many and do they get diluted?
Ryan, Virginia, welcome back to the Executive Compensation Podcast. Great to have you guys here today with us.
Great to be here.
Thanks.
Yep. This is going to be a continuation of our prior podcast where we were talking about executive compensation and strategy. And today we're going to focus on, I'm going to say, distilling things down into, I'll say, core measures or key measures. And I think one of the things I want to submit to both you, Virginia, and you, Ryan, is that most companies don't struggle with incentive design because they lack strategy. They struggle because they cannot reduce that strategy down into a few measurable goals. So that's sort of the theme of today's podcast and something I want to dive deeper with both you, Virginia, and you, Ryan, as we talk about things today. What makes an outcome worth including an incentive compensation framework? Ryan?
Yeah. Again, getting back to what is the underlying rationale of an incentive plan, I think I always start with value creation. And so what are the key value drivers? And you're typically, you're thinking about 2 or 3 things when you're thinking about driving value. You're either growing the top line, so you're driving value through growth. You're growing profitability, so you're improving margins and more of that top line is falling to the bottom line. Or you might be focused on some sort of return. If you're trying to improve capital returns, you might be looking at a return type measure. So those tend to be kind of the 3 big buckets, and something in one of those 3, usually if you're going to only pick one, it's probably profitability, because profitability kind of captures top line and it captures margins to a certain extent. So almost every company seems to pull that in. So those are kind of the big 3 categories, and you might just stop there with 1 or 2 or all 3 of those. Whether you go deeper than that and start thinking about some of those other kind of more fine-tuned metrics is a whole different kind of thought process you have to go through.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to think about is, are you measuring it over the short term or the long term? ROIC is a great example. ROIC is very difficult to move over a 12-month period. So we oftentimes will see that in a longer-term plan where you have a goal over a multi-year period to improve or at least maintain your ROIC. So I think making those determinations early on in the process to ensure that you're able to measure it over a certain time period and able to influence it is important.
Ryan, you said something that just resonated with me, and maybe I'll categorize it as a rule of 3. And, I tell all the associates that work with us as people think in 1, 3s, and 5s. But you shared an income statement comment, you shared a balance sheet statement comment, and then you served an external stakeholder concept or a measurable metric like share price or other things. Is it any more complex than that?
Yeah. No, I think I like the prime numbers. I like the 1, 3, 5, 7. So right. 3 is great. And I mean, I think you could even do like a 3x3 to say it should be rare. I don't want to make a definitive statement. It should be rare that you ever need more than 3 financial measures. And if you ever have non-financials, you should rarely ever have more than 3. So I think that's a good rule of thumb. Again, not ever to be never broken, but I think if you start getting beyond that 3x3 rule, you should really be questioning as a comp committee.
Because you end up duplicating efforts and duplicating focus. Sometimes they can even be conflicting measures. If you have a cash flow measure and then, EBITDA measure, they can operate in a similar fashion, or you can sometimes use one to hedge against the other. So I think once you start adding too many metrics in place, you can start getting conflicting behaviors.
So how do we resist the temptation? I mean, we've all seen those scorecards that exist with 10, 15 measures, or we've seen those plan designs that, they run the universe. How do committees resist the temptation to apply the kitchen sink methodology to the way in which they think about incentive compensation design?
Well, I think you have to push hard, and you have to kind of really ask the management team, and more than likely it's the CEO or CFO who's probably delivering that proposal. Like, what is the underlying rationale behind why we need all these measures? Because if you've got more than, particularly on the financial side, if we've got more than 3, I talked about those 3 buckets. So if you got 4 or 5, then a couple of those are overlapping. They're sitting in one of those same categories. So what is it about if we're using EPS and EBITDA, why do we need both of those? What's the unique driver there? And more often than not, the additional complexity does not, outweigh the fact that whatever benefit you get it doesn't outweigh the additional complexity. And it also, I think, by probing, you need to understand, is there some sort of ulterior motive? Is it more of a hedging of bets? Sometimes you see that where there's a lot of uncertainty, so we're just going to put our eggs in 7 different baskets because we have less chance of getting 0. That might be a valid strategy, but let's at least understand if that's if that's why we're doing it. Let's at least agree as a board and committee that we're trying to diversify risk across the plan, as opposed to just assuming that it's appropriate to have 7 or 8 measures.
I think the other reason we often see more metrics is to try to increase line of sight. So breaking down a more complicated measure into the value drivers of that measure can then create the at least perceived need of including all of them, right? So I think as you move down the organization, we often see breaking apart a measure like EPS or ROIC. What are the true drivers in those, and what can I, as a participant, influence? Sometimes I do think that means adding 1 or 2 more things to the scorecard, and why you see often at kind of the manager and below level, there being more things added to the list. But at the top of the house, what is the true definition of success? It should be fairly simple.
So I was in a conversation the other day with a compensation committee member who was an executive, or is an executive, I should rather say. And he made a point to me by saying, Darren, he had a belief that the compensation plan should be driven from sort of a bottoms-up viewpoint. Like the management team is the one that should bring the design, the measures, the framework to the committee versus it being a top-down view. So we've talked a little bit here, Ryan, you've added some color, and Virginia, you've added some color on, I'm going to say like the number of measures, but let's not focus on the number of measures. Like what are the commercial features or cultural dynamics why you would increase the number of measures and then vice versa, decrease the number of measures? So let's think about it a little bit more philosophically for our listeners rather than saying like 3's the magic number. I'm curious your thoughts there, Virginia.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this in practice recently. We've talked before about utilities, for example. They tend to have a lot of different measures. It cuts across various operational categories, financials. With utilities, it's not all about earnings growth, for example. They've got different constituents they have to play towards. But at some point, the question is, are there too many, and do they get diluted? So I think one of the first things to assess when you're trying to figure out if you have the right number of measures is, are they driving behaviors? Are they measurable? And are they weighted in a way that actually gets attention? I would argue, and I have argued, if it's 2.5% of a total plan, that's too little. And you're not going to get the attention or the incentive that you're looking for if it's that low of a weight. If it's 20%, absolutely you're going to get attention. So I think recognizing that you have to have a certain amount of weight to drive a behavior is the first pass. Secondly, to Ryan's point, is it creating the behavior you're looking for in the end? Stepping back and assessing whether something that's in the plan is actually moving the needle is important. If it's a customer measure and it's not changing behaviors or it's not driving potential future growth of the bottom line, then maybe it's not something that should be focused on.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, as you were talking, Virginia, if there's a regulatory element to this, like the more constituencies you have to try to please, maybe that pushes to at least consider more metrics, because you mentioned utilities. We talked earlier about financial services, yep. Both, generally tend to be more regulated than other industries. Yeah. Healthcare is another example. All of those industries, you see a little higher prevalence in scorecards or multiple measures. So there could be an element of we've got multiple constituencies to be worried about, and so we can't only have 2 or 3 financial metrics. We've got to expand a bit.
Yep, that's fair.
Yep.
So you're a committee.
Yeah.
You're a member of a compensation committee. Management comes to you with, here's 2 financial measures and 10 strategic measures that we want to embed in a compensation program pretend you're a compensation committee member right now, how do you push back on something like that, where you have a principle that I want to keep it simple, I want to keep it clean, I want to keep it appropriately weighted? How does that conversation go if you're the committee member?
Yeah. First of all, probably a blanket statement of mine would be 10's too many. If they come with a couple or 3 or 4, I would start asking the questions. What in here is not already captured through EPS or through your top line growth measure or through whatever your return is? And if it's not, should it be, first of all? But continuing to push and ask the questions of what is this behavior driving, and does that create value? It's a fairly basic question from a committee standpoint.
So, Ryan, play devil's advocate to Virginia's point. I mean, the beauty of what we do is there's shades of gray, and we're not accountants, we're not actuaries. Like, business judgment is included in everything that we're doing here.
I tend to start where Virginia starts. So I tend to really push towards simplicity. If I'm sitting on a committee, I'm probably pushing very hard back on that number of metrics. The times, and I think of one client I work with in particular, and what they have a scorecard. They have probably more than 10 metrics. And while I have pushed the committee to really consider consolidating, and we have consolidated a little bit, we still have a lot of measures. For them, they're in a space where they're highly driven by external macroeconomic forces that are generally outside of the control of management. A change in interest rates, a change of unemployment dramatically impacts their business. And so part of their scorecard is a little bit of a risk diversification across the plan to say, let's diversify risk. Let's also pick things that the management team can have a little bit more control over, because they were getting burned year after year with missing objectives, while the board and management felt like it was a reasonably good year and the stock price was reflecting a decent year, but the incentive plan was not aligning to that. So since they've moved to this, it has mitigated risk. It has resulted in more payouts that are closer to target, fewer that are max and fewer that are min, but it is achieving that objective. So somewhat reluctantly, I'm okay with that type of design, but I think there's unique circumstances where something like that makes sense.
What's interesting about you was what you just shared there, Ryan, is I have a view that committees always use their discretion. All right. I guess the question is, well, at what point in the process are they using their discretion? Are we using it at the beginning of the cycle to set goals, or are we using it at the end of the cycle to take into account those external factors that you've talked about? And there seems to be, I'll say, a willingness among most committees that they'd rather use that discretion up front rather than at the end. Virginia, you said when you were sharing some of your comments and your feedback today, you talked a lot about behavior. I think you used that word a couple times, and are we driving the right behaviors? And we've all heard about culture. If we think about some of the external stakeholders that we have to deal with that are in I'll say the compensation bed with us, as we're advising committees, or committees are working through these challenges, one of the views is they want the former. They want you to set goals up front, and they want you to use that discretion initially rather than using it at the end of the cycle. But if we make comments like culture and behavior, I guess one of the questions that I would ask you is, do those proxy advisors have it wrong? Like, should committees be using their discretion not just at the beginning when they set those goals, but should they have the flexibility to use it at the end as well?
Absolutely. I think there's a balance, however, because I do think to use too much discretion at the end gets to the efficacy of the plan, and then participants don't know what they're trying to achieve. So having a deal set in the beginning, understanding what those goals are, what you're working towards is important. However, knowing that at the end there will be some judgment that is at least explored, I think is important, particularly in today's environment when we do have all these macroeconomic influences. I mean, let's talk about tariffs, right? Nobody knew what to do with that. They set goals for the most part, not understanding the impact to the business. Now, I will say I was actually surprised as we look back over the last cycle, the majority of companies did not adjust for tariffs. They figured out how to run their business with the impacts, included. That was actually a surprise to me, and I think it was a surprise to many others as well. But we had the conversations. The committees did, work through those details at the end, understanding that they might use their judgment to apply a different result. But I think ultimately they ended up not in most cases.
Holding management teams accountable for objectives is important, and therefore formulaic approaches I think are important. Also, that being said, I do think that the pendulum has swung a little bit too far. If you go back, go back 20 years ago, there, the separation between the board and management probably wasn't where it needed to be. There wasn't as much independence on the board. A lot of the board members were kind of brought in by management, and so things shifted dramatically through regulation, through proxy advisors, through a bunch of different avenues. And like I said, I think it's gone maybe a little bit too far to the point now where shareholders are electing board members to use their business judgment, and they're closer than anyone else. They're in the boardroom. They understand the dynamics of the business, and the independence issue, in my opinion, has been solved. They are truly independent, so they're probably not exercising that business judgment as much as they should. Again, it shouldn't be wholesale. We shouldn't get to the end of the year and just throw out the plan and pay out whatever we want. But the ability to, in these unique years, particularly in the last 5 years, which it seems like every year is a quote unquote unique year, having the ability to exercise some judgment as a board member and say, we're going to do some things maybe a little bit differently. I think that's an important element to have.
This is why I like a modifier approach. I like there to be some governor within the plan concept to allow for judgment in the end. And I think you always have that flexibility as a committee, but putting it as a part of the program, I think is a helpful exercise because then it forces them to have those discussions.
So talk to me a little bit more about this modifier concept. And if we're talking about a modifier, if I could think about through the lens that Ryan was talking about it, we're actually talking about maybe some qualitative, subjective considerations, maybe some, what were the impact of tariffs or market conditions, and how they influence the design. Like, Virginia, how do you get that to work?
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky, first of all, but the way that I often see it working is kind of an individual performance modifier, but it's discussed at the executive level, at least in more general terms. It's more about, what did I do that might be different, or how did the company perform that might be somewhat different than where we thought it might, given the financial results. So I view it as a bit of a combination of the two, because I'm actually, not a huge fan of just purely individual, because I think at the executive level, it should be more about team. But I think having those conversations to say, how did we respond differently than how we thought we would, given the inputs that we knew at the time on how we set our goals, and providing an opportunity to have that discussion as a committee, I think is a helpful exercise.
And one caveat we should probably just mention, a lot of what we're talking about, using business judgment or discretion or adjustments, it's a lot easier to do on annual cash plans than equity plans.
Sure. For sure.
There's additional accounting complications. Again, not that you can never do it on a long-term plan, but there's additional accounting challenges that just make it a little bit more problematic if you're doing it there. But on the annual side, it's much more readily available, at least from an accounting perspective.
Ryan, I'm interested in your thoughts on how leadership style impacts some of Virginia's comments and what she shared relative to the modifier. And let me just give you 2 illustrative examples. And I'm interested in your thoughts on this. I have those executives that we work with that say, we're all in this together. And come hell or high water, we are the leadership team. This is part of the employment deal of being a member of this leadership team here. And regardless of what your function is or what your business unit is, we're going to live and die with the financial results of the organization. But then I'll have organizations that the executive or the CEO wants that tension between the organization. He's comfortable with, like, business unit A pushing business unit B to drive those results. And he might want to put a little bit, he or she might want to put a little bit more weight into financial performance. Give us that continuum.
It's a classic tension, and I don't know there's a one size fits all. I have clients on both ends of that spectrum. I have a client that is heavy business unit. 70% of their annual incentive is business unit performance. So they're very much driving that. They're an organization where they have very distinct units that they need to, and they need those heads of those units driving performance as if they're running separate companies. That's a bit of a unique situation. I would say more often than not, companies fall into the first camp you described, where, hey, we're in this together. We're a single team. We rely on each other for products, we pass employees around. We're sharing capital, and we need to, all the boats need to float up and down on the same sea. So So I think more often than not, it's the first category, but it is a very case-by-case specific and specific to the industry and the business.
Virginia, you mentioned something that we all think about in the environment that we're in about tariffs, and I would argue we still haven't figured out. We're still living in this consistent uncertainty as we think about either changes in policies or we think about some of the geopolitical environments. But one thing that I think we all agree on and we know for sure is like the pace of change is increasing at an increasing rate. So I think one of the challenges that a lot of organizations deal with is how do I fulfill my short-term financial needs, but make sure I'm investing for the midterm and the long term. And we've talked a lot about on this particular session about keeping it simple, right? And thinking about what are the three measures that we want to look at and maybe what are some of the behavioral levers that we want to drive. Put yourselves in the shoes of those organizations that need to make these midterm and long-term investments. How do we think about that through an incentive compensation design?
I mean,
right?
that question actually triggered just a thought. Like, again, years ago, if we go back decades, it seems like there were more plans that they probably didn't call them midterm performance plans, but they acted more like a midterm. You saw things like cash long-term incentive plans and other kind of performance-based plans that filled that gap. And stock options or equity was the real long-term vehicle. And then, of course, the cash annual incentive was the short-term. Maybe that needs to come back, and maybe that will start coming back where you've got all three of those elements. I mean, people are already talking about longer term vesting on stock options and restricted stock. And so maybe if the market moves that direction, maybe there is an opportunity to kind of have your annual cash being the short term, some sort of performance based plan, probably PSUs as that midterm element, and then long term vested 5, 6, 7 year vested options or RSUs that are really the long-term value driver. Maybe we'll see that come back.
I have a couple clients that have used this kind of midterm concept, and the way that they've done it, and I think pretty effectively, is to target, and it may not necessarily be in between the short and the long term. This is more almost on top of what's already there. But for example, one company did an outperformance plan. So they had annual goals in their short-term plan based on revenue growth. The only way the outperformance plan paid out is if they were above and beyond that max growth. So if it was 7% on an annual basis, it had to be 10% on a midterm basis. So they were really trying to provide that over-the-top opportunity for even more growth over time. They're now considering should they put in place a new outperformance plan as the current one comes to the end of its cycle. I had another client back post-COVID did a similar type approach. We're all in this together. It was to hundreds of people, not just to the executives. And again, it was one single measure. It was an earnings-based measure. And it was all about kind of getting back to where they were pre-COVID. They were very impacted by the pandemic, and they wanted to have a kind of a rallying cry. So I see a room for these types of programs. I think the balance is making sure it's not all just on top of, and making sure that it's measuring something above and beyond the traditional programs.
Is what's old new? Like you're talking about outperformance. There's an under theme of exponential growth in almost everything that we've talked about over these last couple of minutes related to, I'm going to say, artificial intelligence and advances in technology. Go back 30 years ago, people made their money or were incentivized on stock options. That's probably a little bit longer term than like the 3-year cycle that we live in now. Is that going to make a comeback, Ryan?
It could, and of course there's the big headline programs. I mean, Elon Musk is the biggest example, but there's others where you get these very very unique, highly performance based plans with very very significant leverage. There's a few big examples, but I think more and more we're getting companies, particularly ones that are making big bets and really trying to transform their business to say, should we be putting in a very long-term, higher leverage and high performance requirement? Of course, the key there is those two have to be aligned. You can't just have the high payout without the high performance. If those two things are truly aligned, very often shareholders get behind those because everybody's swimming in the same direction. But sometimes they're misaligned. The executive team would like to see the high payout, but maybe they're not quite as willing to tie it to really, really stretch performance.
I think it also requires a certain comfort level with risk. I have 2 clients, by the way. I think there's I think 4, maybe 5 S&P 500 companies that use 100% stock options in their long-term plan. 2 of them are my clients. Every year, we continue to test the appropriateness of using 100% stock options in their plan. And every year, they tell me, we appreciate the input, we're good to go, which I'm not pushing back on because they have grown. They have experienced significant leverage through their programs. It has worked. So I think there's room for that in certain circumstances, but they also recognize that if performance starts to soften, they may need to diversify, and hopefully they won't be too far behind the curve in order to do that. So,
And I mean, the whole theme of this particular podcast is keep it simple.
yeah,
right?
that's simple.
Like
Yep.
we're going to keep it simple. And in that particular circumstance, Virginia, that's probably as simple and clean as it gets.
Yeah.
If we think about just the overarching construct of a program, share with the audience, like, what are the qualifiers or considerations that if you went that, if you went with that design and we're in like all our eggs are in one basket, and that's, like I said, as simple as possible, what are the qualifiers or the conversations that you're having with the committee and the management team
Yeah.
about understanding like what the deal is here?
Yeah. Well, not only are they using 100% options, they both have a very simplistic annual plan. It's all about earnings. So it's breaking down, I think, the elements of what defines success and how are we creating shareholder value. It's through earnings growth, and it's through, which eventually, if they succeed in their objectives, which they require growth year after year after year, which not every company can do, then it will come out in, share price appreciation, which they've experienced. The qualifiers, it's a highly risky plan. And to the extent they do find themselves in a softening performance environment, we continue to counsel them that there will be consequences and they could potentially have significant amounts of money underwater, which then could lead to retention concerns. So back to our earlier conversation, continuing to test the appropriateness year after year based on what they think is coming. At some point, they may decide to diversify that risk, and that won't be a signal that they're no longer going to grow. It's just a matter of kind of that comfort level with the risk. Not everybody understands the value of an option. So communication is critical, making sure these participants understand it. They are holding it till the end, which I assure you in these 2 situations, they are. They've got incredible retention rates when it comes to exercisability, but also making sure that that gets communicated well into the organization, because this is not just about the senior executives with this program. Mm-hmm. It goes pretty far down into the organization.
So their incentive compensation communication strategy is robust?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
absolutely.
and building off of that, if you're around me long enough, you probably hear me say this, but I like to sometimes step back and think, if I was a billionaire and I owned 100% of the company, and I was designing the pay program, what would I want to design to align with where I wanted to take the business? And if you think through that kind of mental exercise, I almost always end up in something similar to what Virginia just described. Very simple, minimal measures, very long term, very stock based, long term stock options, maybe restricted stock. But it tends to guide you to simplicity. I can't think I've ever gone through that mental exercise and said, boy, I want 7 metrics and I want to have all these different programs overlapping. You tend to lean much more to simplicity. And I think part of that is because if you were the sole owner and you're sitting on the board, you're governing not just through incentives. And that's an important role of the board. The board, good boards are governing as a board, and incentives support that, but the incentives is not the only tool for governance. And so again, I think it's a helpful mental exercise for committee members sometimes to go through, and it probably drives you towards simplicity.
So first of all, you're not a billionaire. Is that what you're telling the world in this podcast? That Ryan Harvey's not a billionaire.
I do not own any companies outright.
Right. I also don't know too many billionaires that are doing the executive compensation podcast. So I think that's, I think we can overlay that. Yeah. This episode is sponsored by Meridian Compensation Partners. Meridian combines rigorous market analysis with experienced judgment so committees can reach conclusions they can defend. Visit meridiancp.com to learn more. Ryan, Virginia, let's bring in something timely. We're about at the end of proxy season. And about a couple of months ago, we had an update from both ISS and Glass Lewis on their policy updates. And one of the things that clearly we saw from that update is, I'll say, maybe a bit of a softening of some of their policies, and we saw some things particularly tied to our earlier conversation around examining the willingness to think about long-term incentives maybe slightly differently. So, rather than just being overly weighted on PSUs, they sort of opened the door to, I'm going to say, looking at longer-term vesting of time-based vehicles. That's a bit of a big shift for both ISS and Glass Lewis relative to where they've been historically. I guess my question to you is, have we seen a change in design, or do we think this is going to influence incentive design on a go-forward basis? What are your thoughts, Virginia?
Yes, I think definitely over time we will likely see shifts in the way that organizations are thinking about plan designs. This kind of extension over a longer time period, potentially using time-based awards, but making them vest over a long time period. What I've seen is looking over 5 years, even if it's a prorated vest over 5. That's longer than the typical 3. Not requiring performance measures over that longer time period, which I know a lot of companies have struggled with, particularly post-COVID, uncertainty, the macroeconomic influences. It's very difficult for some companies to think that long term. But this gives them the opportunity to, again, tie to that eventual shareholder value creation, as long as they're continuing to focus on the financially driven measures that they use under their short-term plan. I think this is an opportunity for companies to think about.
Does Virginia have it right?
She definitely has it right. I think we will see some influence here. I guess one thing I would just say, and this is, I think, true of all Meridian's consultants, that we would always say, don't let the proxy advisors direct design. Committees should always fully understand how ISS and Glass Lewis are going to respond to various changes. But we would never say design something because it's going to get support from ISS and Glass Lewis. That being said, they do have influence, and we know they have influence on committee decisions. With my clients, and this just may be because I haven't driven it as hard as maybe it could be, we're starting some conversations here and there about longer term vesting. I wouldn't say it's a significant part of the conversation yet. If we had a couple of examples, and I'm not aware of any yet, but once we get fully through this proxy season and really have an opportunity to analyze all of the ISS reports and Glass Lewis and all of the proxies, we may see a few concrete examples where a company was called out and said, you have 6-year vesting on stock options, and we are considering that to be performance-based. I don't think I'm not aware of anything that's been that explicit where a company has gotten credit. They've gotten the box checked for having performance-based long-term incentives, and the only thing that drove that was longer vesting. I think we see more examples like that. It will start to open the door a bit, and committees might get a little more comfortable with exploring that.
I wonder how long this is going to take to run through the system. To your point, Virginia, I had someone in a meeting said to me the other day, this is just not in our ethos, to just give time-based awards over a 7-year time period. And I think that goes back to our conversation related to strategy and culture and philosophy. So I wonder if there'll have to be significant shifts in philosophy before there's a willingness to adopt this. The other interesting thing, and we always talk about benchmarking, and you referenced it, Ryan, as to has anybody done it just yet? I've had a few committee chairs say, look, I'm willing to have this conversation, but I don't want to be the first mover. So I think there'll be some first mover. It'll be interesting to see what industry and what firm is the first mover on some of these things.
Yeah. What I would anticipate is for those companies that still have, 70, 75% performance-based and just that, smaller portion that's time-based, they might be more willing to do a 50-50 split, for example, and instead carving out, that remaining 30% to some longer-term vehicle. Will we get to a point where they're, 100% time-based and it's over a 7-year period and that's the way everyone operates? Probably not.
One of the things we have to solve for, which it'll be interesting how this works, is there's a study where they measure sort of the length of the leadership team at CEO tenure at, I think we're sitting at 6 years, down from 8, down from 7, 5 or 6 years ago. So there's been a little bit more of a churn in the system related to leadership. There's also this trend of younger CEOs taking over in this role. So, maybe market forces will move things in this direction.
I think it's going to put pressure on termination provisions for sure. And, the interesting idea of potentially post-retirement hold, right? So tying the executives even after they leave to price appreciation.
Or what's even the appropriate retirement age?
Right. Yeah.
Another interesting question that we could probably do a whole podcast on that. All right. Let's go over to my favorite part of our segment, Ryan and Virginia. What we did it last session. We loved it so much. We're going to continue it, which we'll title Agree or Disagree. So this is an opportunity for me to maybe give some provocative statements and ask you if you agree or disagree with where we're going on these things. And obviously, you're both allowed to agree with each other, but I hope you don't. So let's have something to talk about here. So let's pressure test some of the assumptions that we've talked about. If you're listening on Spotify and finding these conversations useful, take a second to rate the show. It helps more committee members find this content. Now let's get into it, Virginia and Ryan. We can disagree on some things. Here we go with some of these statements. So if you need more than 3 outcomes, your strategy is not clear enough. Agree or disagree, Ryan?
I am going to agree.
I'm going to disagree.
Okay. I think I'm going to disagree too. So, Ryan, why do you agree? Why do you agree with that statement?
And everything has a caveat, but I think if for the vast majority of companies, you should be able to boil your strategy down to 3 primary outcomes, in generally financial outcomes. Is this a universal truth? Would I ever say that you can't go beyond 3? No, obviously, and I have clients that I support who go beyond 3. But I would say in general, if you're going beyond 3, you need to circle back and either make sure that you're aligned to the strategy that you have, or do you have an appropriate strategy to begin with?
Yeah, and I think the reason I disagreed is I thought about the question a little differently. To me, a well-defined strategy does articulate, primary drivers of that strategy, and I agree there should not be 10. But are there opportunities at some stage of life to have 5 potentially? And then figuring out which of those should lend itself into your incentive plan designs, for example. It may not be all 5, but you might have 5 different objectives that your company needs to achieve over the next 3 to 5 years. So that's kind of the way I thought about it.
Yeah, I think about this through the experiences that I've lived through, and living as a consultant through the financial crisis and advising those companies through the financial crisis. You learn that there's lots of stakeholders to be mindful of. So there are clearly shareholders where I would say, I would agree with you, Ryan, like there are 3 measures that are really important to those shareholders and those investors. But we also have the regulators to deal with. I like to say there's taxpayers, and just going through sort of all the things that we went through, and the customers and the treatment of those customers. And I think in some of the clients I observe, that would be really hard to distill that down to just 3 measures. And that gets back to our conversation of there's clearly the what, but I think there's the how in which we do things. And that's just influenced the way that I advise my clients over time. So I wish I could distill it down to just 3, but I think it's depending upon what industry you're in, there's probably some other things that you need to give thought to. Question number 2. A board should never approve a scorecard it cannot explain itself.
I am going to, on a technicality, change my vote. I was going to agree, but I'm going to disagree. I want to agree with this, but I'm going to disagree.
It cannot explain.
The scorecard itself.
I'm going to disagree, but with a caveat.
Okay, so you've both disagreed. So I think by nature I have to agree with that statement. And maybe I'll go first, and then I'll let you just share your views on it. The question's clearly unique. I don't want the board to explain the scorecard itself. I want the board to explain why that's important to drive sort of outcomes and make sure it's worthwhile that an investor would spend their money on it. So I would agree. I want them to understand it. I don't think they have to understand it in just like the ultimate granular level of details as if the executive leadership team, but I'd want them to be able to at least defend why. And I just think that's an important part of, I would say, their job as a trustee or a stakeholder of the organization.
So I wanted to agree with this because I like the statement. I think it is probably a good guiding principle for committees to say, can we commit this to, is this simple enough that we can commit this to memory? So I think it's a great guiding principle. What threw me off was the never. As a consultant, it's hard to say never. So there are circumstances where that you may have to go for complexity over simplicity. But I do love the statement.
So Ryan doesn't deal in absolutes. That's what we've just learned.
Well, and I'm with Ryan on that. I think there's always going to be a circumstance where you might have a more complicated measure. There might be nuances to that measure. There's been plenty of conversations where I feel like the board is kind of being educated on how, a customer measure might work, or how a third party is assessing a certain, index. I had a situation just last week where a company has been measuring kind of a JD Power type index over time, and it's in their incentive plan. And one of the directors actually had no idea, what was involved in the metric itself. But it was a core, kind of a core competency from the company's standpoint, and something that they really use as a management tool. So I think, making sure you're educating your board is a really important part of the process, and obviously educating plan participants. But I think there are some things that sometimes boards may not be as familiar with.
All right, last question. Broad strategic goals should stay out of an incentive plan unless they can be measured.
I agree with that statement.
Oh, I agree too. Yeah.
And I'll take it a little further. Not only do I agree with it, I think even if you took off the second part of that, unless they can be clearly measured, I think generally broad strategic goals shouldn't be in incentive plans because they're already captured by the big financial goals. So I would generally argue strategic goals should be much more specific. They're tied to transformation, they're tied to other things, but very broad strategic goals, those are already captured. So,
yeah. And particularly if they aren't measurable. I think that's when you get into kind of the more qualitative components of success. And I think that's a really difficult thing for committees to opine on and to apply a factor to.
I agree with what each of you shared. I would say the one area that I would probably push is functional leadership. So in general, functional leadership is if you think about a head of HR or general counsel or all those or those roles, a chief risk officer, a head of technology, those are roles where I would say we are making statements today on get more efficient, right? And or implement AI into your processes. Those are things that, to me, that are really hard to measure, but they are tied to efficiency, but they won't show up, immediately in a margin measure or a return measure. But there are things that we have to do to, I would say, incentivize and reward those functional leadership. So I'll agree with the principle for, I would say, the revenue producing roles, but I think there's an opportunity to rethink this for some of the functional leadership, given where we are today, where some of the broad statement is find a better way to do something, but how do you measure find a better way to do something? Like, that's hard to do over the short term.
Yeah. It goes back to the modifier. I think you can do that through use of a modifier.
There you go.
Yeah, agree.
All right.
Yeah.
Free advice. There you go, right there. All right. Well, Ryan, Virginia, thank you so much. In our next episode, we go after one of the biggest mistakes in executive pay design. A lot of plans reward activity and call it performance. We are going to unpack the difference between movement and value creation and why boards get that distinction wrong more often than they think. Remember, good governance is not about having the most complex plan, but one that is understood by management and shareholders. Until next time.